Hello, and welcome to my session on the internals of a PBIX file and how pbi-tools make sense of it all. My name is Mathias Thierbach. Let's get started. Let me introduce myself first. I am head of finance systems at YouGov in London, where I'm leading an analytics and data management team. I've worked with Power BI since 2016. Previously, I've been a software engineer and software architect, and you may know me as the author of pbi-tools, which will feature heavily in this session. Find my contact information at the bottom of this slide and follow me on Twitter if you like. Remember, I'm also available in a live chat whilst this session is running. Let's look at the agenda. There are two main parts to this session. First, we're going to look at PBIX files and the fact that they're actually just zip files. We're going to look what's inside them, and we're going to understand that there are basically three different types of PBIX files. Then we're going to explore PBI-tools, which is a tool explicitly designed to uncover the contents of PBIX files and make them better suitable for source control in particular. We're going to look at the specific folder format used by PBI-tools. We're going to see how to use PBI-tools to track changes when working with Power BI Desktop. And we're going to see how to use what we've learned to make offline changes and feed them back into valid PBIX files. And lastly, we're going to look at PBI-tools deployments, which basically combine all of the features end to end. Before we get started, though, let me make one really important disclaimer. It's important to know that none of the information shared in this session about the contents and the formats of PBIX files is officially documented by Microsoft, which also means that any details may change in the future. So just be aware, whatever this session covers is effectively a snapshot of where things are in September 2022. With that said, let's switch over into some demos. I've prepared a few files we're going to be looking at. At this point, we're going to be focusing on this particular file, Contoso sales.pbix. I've actually got it open in Power BI Desktop so we can see what it looks like in a very familiar way to us. So this is a file which has a lot of features enabled, which are possible in Power BI Desktop. So first of all, there's a data model in here. And we can tell, because we've got this table view where we can basically switch through the various tables we've got in our model, and we can see every single data point and every single row. We've got a diagram view here, which shows us how our various tables are connected and what columns and measures they contain. And we also have a report in that file, which happens to have 5 different pages. We can see that here. On top of that, there's one custom visual imported. We can see over here the chiclet slicer. We can also see right next to it, there's actually an external image which is embedded. And lastly, this page has a mobile layout defined, which we can see here. So we can switch across, and that's the mobile view for this particular page. All right. So I said earlier, PBIX files are basically just zip files. So let's take a look at this one. I'm going to create a copy of it. And then I'm going to change the extension and turn this into a zip file. And here we go. I've got a zip file now. Explorer changes the icon. I can actually double click into it and I can see the contents. In order to make those more accessible to us, I'm going to switch across to Visual Studio Code. And in order to see the zip contents, what I need to do is one more thing, which is go to extract, confirm. So that's going to create a subfolder. Here we go. That's a subfolder. And this is showing us what's in that zip file. And I'm just going to go through top to bottom And because we know what's inside the file, I'm going to identify the various bits and pieces for us. So first of all, we saw that the Microsoft Chiclet slicer was embedded into the report as a custom visual. And we can see that here. There's a custom visuals folder inside the report folder, and Chiclet slicer is a subfolder. So we can recognize that. Um, Going into another folder called static resources, we can see under registered resources that image which we saw in the report is actually contained in here as a PNG file. There's another resource as well, which is this JSON file that contains our report theme. If you're familiar with Power BI desktop themes, you'll recognize this. And going one step down, there's a file that doesn't have an extension, but we can see when we open it that it contains JSON. It's called just layout, and that one is a definition of all our report pages, the various filters used in them, and all visuals used on the various reports, which every single one of their settings. And as we can see, there's a lot of stuff in here, and it's actually quite verbose. Linguistic schema is used for Q&A and basically contains a dictionary of certain keywords. And we've got a third file inside the reports folder, which is called mobile state. Remember, I pointed out that we had a mobile view defined for our very first page. That's basically what's contained in here. So moving out of the report folder, content types.xml, that's a standard file which simply contains some metadata for the particular zip format that's used by Microsoft here. And data model is very interesting. Remember, we saw the file actually had an entire data model embedded. Now, this one does not show up. So this is one file or one piece of content which we can't visualize easily because it's fully binary. Diagram layout. Remember, we looked at the layout view earlier. That's a JSON definition of the various tables and where they actually show up. We've got metadata, again, a JSON file. You see there's quite a pattern here. Most of those files are actually JSON. The most interesting thing here is basically this one. It always contains the version number from the Power BI desktop release the file was last saved with. We've got another binary file, this one, security binding. So that basically contains just some hash codes. So again, nothing we can visualize. We've got settings, again, JSON. And then lastly, we've got a version file. This one says 1.25. And that version number effectively indicates which feature set of what Power BI Desktop offers is actually in use here. 1.25 is currently the default version that's emitted whenever you create a new file in Power BI Desktop. So all those files I've just explained are listed for your reference, and you can find those in the slide deck later. And we can see what format each file contains, also what encoding. That's quite particular for PBIX files, because some of the content parts use a UTF-8 and others use a UTF-16 encoding. And you can find some notes alongside it as well. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are effectively three different types of PBIX files. The one we just looked at, the Contoso sales.pbix, that's what we usually call a thick report. And a thick report means we've got a report, as in report pages and visuals defined, but we also have a tabular model included in that file. Remember, we couldn't actually visualize that. I said it was a binary content part. The reason for that is the model is actually embedded as a analysis services backup file, or ABF, database backup. So that's what we call a thick report. There's also what people generally call a thin report, which is basically just a report definition. So only a definition of pages and visuals. And we, in this case, we don't have an embedded data model. Instead, we have a connection file which links those report pages to a remote data set. And then lastly, we have PBIT files, and those are effectively the same as thick reports. The only difference is that we don't have a data model backup embedded here. Instead, we only have data model metadata. When you create a PBIT file, T stands for template, and then reopen it in Power BI Desktop, the first thing you have to do is to actually rehydrate that model by basically loading all the model data back into the database. The next slide is going to give us an overview of how those three types of files differ with respect to the internal contents. So here we go. We've got the exact same PBIX internal content files listed, and we can see whether or not they apply to a particular type of PBIX file. Let's take one example. If we're looking at data model, which shows up in just below the center, we can see that in a thick report, a data model is required. In a PBIT file, the data model does not apply, but instead we have data model schema, which is not a binary file. This is a JSON file just containing metadata. In a thin report, in turn, neither of those two apply, because we simply do not have an embedded model at all. What we have instead is a connections file. So let's just switch back to our demo space, because I've now extracted two more files so we can actually see those differences very explicitly. So looking at the Contoso sales PBIX, as I said, we've got data model here as a binary file. We can't see that. Looking at the PBIT version of exactly the same one, we actually have data model schema. And as we can tell, this is something which can be rendered, and it's basically TMSL tabular JSON. And going to our thin report, we can see there's a connections file here. And for some reason, VS Code doesn't pick this one up as JSON, so I'm going to help it along a little bit. Here we go. So that's also JSON. And if I go to format document, we can make it nicely readable to us. And what's happening here, we're basically referencing the GUID for a remote data set in our Power BI tenant. And that's how the report is ultimately linked to the data set. And that concludes our exploration of PBIX files as zip files. Let's now switch to the second main part of this session, where we're looking at pbi-tools. As mentioned before, pbi-tools was designed specifically to make the contents of PBIX files more accessible to us, and specifically to actually format those contents so that they're compatible with source control systems. pbi-tools is open source on GitHub. You can see the link here. There's also a website, pbi.tools, and it's currently a command line tool. So something which you need to be aware of makes it a bit more techy and geeky to work with. Hopefully, I'll find the time to work on the UI later. Look at the link at the very bottom of this chart. It gives you a end-to-end getting started tutorial, which shows you how to download the tool, how to set it up on your machine, and it actually guides you through a few practical steps to make yourself familiar with it. This diagram shows the three main pillars in a workflow when using PBI tools. Going from left to right, you extract the contents of a PBIX file into a folder structure called PBIX proj. Those can be committed into a source control system and held there centrally. The deploy command on the right compiles those PBIX proj sources back into PBIX files in order to publish them to Power BI service. Let's take a look at the extract command first. We're back in our Visual Studio Code view here. And I've already installed pbi-tools following the tutorial which I mentioned earlier. So I can invoke it by just typing pbi-tools. If I run it without specifying any further actions, it actually puts out some documentation and lists out all the actions and their particular use currently available to you. So what I want to do here is I want to use the extract command on the controls of sales PBIX file we've looked at before, and it only takes a few seconds or so. Here we go. We've got a new folder in our directory. By convention, this is called the same as the originating PBIX file, just without the extension. So that's called controls of sales. And we can see that there are some similarities to what we looked at previously, but there are also a few differences. So one key difference is that all files actually have proper extensions, which allows text editors like VS Code, for instance, to recognize the file type. So going bottom up, we saw that version file before that has a TXT ending now. Looking at report settings, that one has a JSON extension. By convention, pbi-tools gives you formatted JSON, so that things are actually much more readable to humans in particular. This is report metadata. Remember, we saw the Power BI desktop version here. We've got our XML file containing some linguistic phrases. We've got our diagram layout. And this file, PBIX proj.json, that's a pbi-tools specific file containing some metadata. Looking at the subfolders here, we can recognize static resources and custom visuals. Those are contained in exactly the same way as we saw them earlier. But what is slightly different now is the report and the model folder. Let's look at report first of all. In here, we've got a much more granular breakdown of the various components of our report definition. Remember, in the zip view, that was actually called the report layout file. We can see this entire folder structure contains a relatively large number of JSON files, and they all define different aspects of our report. So report.json is the top level file, if you will. So that one, for instance, registers the various additional files we've got embedded as resources. We recognize that PNG file here. We also recognize this report themes file. We recognize the custom visual reference. If we're looking at config.json, there are quite a few things we can recognize. For instance, looking at settings, we can see things like what is our export data mode, whether or not the visual container header should be hidden, whether the new filter pane experience should be enabled or disabled. So if we just switch over to Power BI Desktop briefly and go into options, here we go, current file, report settings, basically all the settings listed here, they are all encoded in this particular settings piece. So this is basically top-level information about the report itself. If we then dig deeper, we can see information about specific pages. The technical term inside the report layout file is section rather than page. pbi-tools retains that particular term, and we can see that each report page actually has a subfolder here. And things are repeated now. So at this particular level, where we're basically looking at one specific page, we have a top-level file, section.json, which defines certain parameters of that page, like the display name, like the height and width. also the internal technical name. We can see a config file, which in this particular case is empty. We can also see a filters file, again, that's empty here. And then we can go further down to the visual level. So, and the same pattern applies. Every single visual placed on a particular page is found in a dedicated subfolder. If we're looking at this as an example, that's the chiclet slicer. Over here, this is where we're using the chiclet slicer custom visual against the product category from our model. That's precisely what's defined here. So we've got a top level file representing this particular visual, which contains coordinates and dimensions. We've got a config file, which in the case of visuals actually contains most of the relevant information. So if we're just collapsing a few items here, this is a very common layout. And if you've looked at a number of those visual config files, you'll recognize the structure. There's a name, effectively random GUID. Then we've got the layout information repeated. And then we have another property called single visual. It's always called that, where we're referencing what's the visual type, how am I linking certain fields in my visual to columns and measures from my model, what's the corresponding query, and what are the various settings I've made. So settings are all held under objects, got a slightly awkward and pretty verbose format. So here, for instance, that's the general object, and we're looking at the columns property, which happens to be set to the numeric value of 1. And what does that mean? Basically, if I go to my general setting here and look at columns, this is precisely what we've just looked at in the source code. We can see mobile state is expanded into some slightly more readable JSON. That's the most relevant piece here, where we're basically referencing a particular visual in a particular page. This one happens to be a pivot table visual, which is the internal technical name for matrix. And we can see that this particular matrix has a mobile specific setting, and the setting is on the title object, where first of all the show property is set to true and the text property is set to sales. Last but not least, we've got our model. The same principle applies. Rather than having one single file that is huge and contains all the information, things are broken out into a more structured format. And in fact, if you've used the tabular editor save to folder format, you'll recognize this because it's actually quite similar in terms of the underlying principles. So we've got a top level object, which in this case is database.json. That's got our model definition, where we've got annotations, expressions, relationships, and all our model tables in turn are actually broken out to subfolders, where every folder within the tables directory presents one of the model tables. So if we go at customer as an example, we can see again there is a top level JSON file corresponding to that tabular object. We're defining the table called customer. We can see there's a single M partition here. We can also see there's an annotation, and we then want to see the various columns defined. They're held here in another subfolder where every single file represents one particular column. So if we're looking as an example at city, this is standard tabular JSON, TMSL, name, data type, source column. So, and this is basically what pbi-tools gives us when we use the extract command and when we then go through the corresponding folder structure. We've got another diagram here on the next slide, which shows us side by side what we saw in the extracted zip file initially. So basically the raw content, and how that ultimately translates into the pbi-tools format, which is optimized in terms of making file contents readable. So you can refer to this particular slide for reference. So let's move to our next demo. What we want to look at now is how we can use PBI-tools in order to track changes in a live capacity, if you will, as we make them. And this is particularly useful when we combine that with a source control system. I'm going to stay with this particular example. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to commit all those new files we've just extracted into my Git repository to basically say this is a particular version of my project. And having those files committed will then allow me to actually see just the particular changes I'm causing by interacting with that same PBIX file in Power BI Desktop. So just going to source control view in VS Code, and I'm going to say extracted Contoso sales sources. If I switch back here, you can see the color coding is actually gone. Everything shows up in the standard white color now, whereas previously those files were showing up as green. Green means they've just been added to the folder and they haven't been committed to source control. I still have the file open in Power BI Desktop and I'll leave it there. Just a quick recap. This is the command we used previously. PBI-tools extract with a reference to the PBIX file. So that's the extract command used with an offline file. What we want to do now is to actually use a slightly different flavor of PBI-tools extract, which is going to monitor a file that's being worked. In order to do that, I need to run PBI-tools info first, because that will give me some information about any Power BI desktop sessions that are currently open on my machine. So that's the output from PBI-tools info. And I can see down here, there is one session listed where this particular file is open. And the important and relevant piece of information for the next step is actually this. If you want to connect to a running session of Power BI Desktop at this point, you need to look up the internal process ID and you need to ref. Let's keep in mind 15576. And then rather than referencing the file name, we're going to say -PID, and then we're going to say -watch and hit enter. And so we can trigger changes by clicking the save button in Power BI Desktop. Let's make a very simple and arguably trivial change, but just so we see how things work. I'm going to change the active page, because even that is a piece of metadata that's recorded by Power BI Desktop. So I haven't done anything else. I've just clicked to the second page, and I'm going to click the save button now. And you can see there's stuff going on in the background. So this is basically PBI-tools recognized. The file was saved. So it's now doing an extract of the latest changes. I can see things now show up in yellow. VS Code is using color coding. Yellow means the file has changed. We can see here which files that applies to, and we can also specifically go into the source control view in order to have those files listed out. The one change I've just triggered is actually held in this file. We can see that is the port level config file, and we can see the active section index change from 0 to 1. We can actually commit this particular file selective. And that was a report change. Let's make a model change just so we can see that that's also possible. I'm going to set a description on a particular model element. Let's go to the product table. Here I've got my description box. And I'm going to say finds all current products. Here we go. If I then save again, we'll see in a second PBI-tools kicking off. If I then go to my source control view, we're going to expect to see a change in our product table. There we go. We didn't have a description property previously. Now we've got one, and that's precisely what we would do. So you can already see how PBI-tools allows you to get a very granular and useful view inside your project, both for the model as well as for the report as you're making changes to it. Let's just switch back to our slides. Here we go. And let's recap what we just looked at. So this is a description of the PBI-tools extract command. There's also a link to the documentation for that command on the PBI-tools website. And we have two examples here showing the two different flavors of extract. One from an offline file, the other one in watch mode from a file that's open in Power BI. And we can also see how and where to look up that process ID by using PBI-tools info. Now let's move on to the next section of exploring PBI-tools. We've, just to recap, we've now got an understanding of the various components held inside the PBIX file, and we've also seen how PBI-tools happens to represent those contents. So what we can do now is to actually take advantage of that and make direct changes to some of the files and then recompile things back into PBIX files from the extracted folder structure. There are some interesting scenarios possible, which we're going to explore here and which actually aren't possible in any other way. So let's switch to the next demo. We're going to, first of all, see how we can reassemble a working PBIX file just from PBIX proj sources. So I'm back in my project, and I'm just going to do something very radical now. I'm going to completely delete the Contoso Sales PBIX file. So I'm going to use another command, which is pbi-tools compile, where I'm just referencing the folder I want to compile sources from. Now, there we go. So now I've got a new PBIT file generated from all the sources in my Contoso Sales, and we can also see that something's changed here because this is now showing up in orange. So let's open this one up to prove that this is still a fully working file. All our data has been loaded, and I now have a fully working PBIX project open in Power BI Desktop, and I can see that all the various changes we made earlier are all still retained. So for instance, the second page is still showing up as our landing page. Switching across to the first page, we can see we've got the custom visual here and the extra image. And hovering over the product table, I can see that the description I put in earlier is showing up here. So we've gone full circle. We made changes in Power BI Desktop to start with. We extracted into a folder structure. Then we recompiled into a PBIT file, opened that file in Power BI Desktop, and rehydrated it by actually loading all the data from the external sources. Let's just switch back to our slides. We can see this one here where the two different flavors of our PBI-tools compile command are listed. We can either just specify a folder name, in which case the PBIX format is assumed. That will not work when there's a data model in place, but it will be fine when it's a thin report. And when there's a data model involved, we need to explicitly specify the PBIT format and optionally also the override flag. Let's go a bit further. If I switch back here to our project, we can now bring things together in a very interesting way, given that we've seen we can go back and forth between single file and folder using PBI-tools. We've looked into the components that make up a PBIX file. We have some understanding of what the various bits and pieces in there do. So we can actually leverage that in a creative way now. For instance, one example that lots of people ask for and sometimes struggle with is I have a thick report. So again, this is what Contoso Sales is. And I actually want to be able to split it into a thin report, which should be connected to an external data model, right? Sometimes you start off as a single file like we have here. You put all your queries in, you model the data set, and then you invest a lot of time and effort into designing various report pages and visuals, and you then want to be able to actually develop that report further as a thin report. And that's not something which Power BI Desktop supports out of the box. But we can easily achieve that given what we know about the internal file structures. Because what we know is that a thin report has a connections file that's basically a reference to a Power BI hosted data set, whereas a thick report has the data model defined. So if we're combining those two things, we can very easily go into a folder. We can duplicate the subfolder that contains our thick report and then just make two changes to it. Remove the model and actually put a valid connections file in there, one that links to an existing online data set with the same schema. And then we recompile and we can actually upload that, and we will get a valid thin report from that. So let me just rename this. Let's call this Contoso report. And then let's do two things. Number one, delete the model. And number two, go to the thin report, grab the connections file and put it in here. There we go. Once this is recompiled into a PBIX file, it will actually give us a thin report. So here we go. If I just do pbi-tools compile Contoso report, now it's created a PBIX file for me. If I go into my Power BI tenant and go here and say upload file and do local file, specify Contoso report, the one we just produced, our report is now available in our workspace. We can see that here. Let's open it and see whether it all worked. First of all, we can see the custom settings we made earlier are in place. For instance, our second page is our landing page. If we switch across to our first page, we can see custom visual is here, our embedded image. Everything looks exactly as it looked before in Power BI Desktop. Switching to lineage view for our report, we can also see that this is in fact a thin report that's connected to a data set in a completely different workspace. Before we look at some further offline editing options, let's introduce the final session topic for today, pbi-tools deployments. With dataset and report sources held in source control, pbi-tools allows setting up CI/CD pipelines to deploy into Power BI service straight from sources. Let's set this up for a demo report before we make further offline edits, because that will allow us to no longer having to manually upload our PBIX files. pbi-tools deployments use the deploy command. All the configuration for that is held in a deployment manuscript that's also under source control. Let's switch back to our project. We can see there's a PBIX proj JSON file in the root of our folder, not directly linked to any of our extraction folders. And that one actually contains the deployment manifest I just mentioned. Opening this one up, we can see that file is somehow special in that it has a deployments property, and nested inside deployments. In this case, we can see two different settings, one for dataset, one for report. Let's just focus on the report one for now. It's pretty straightforward. We're saying it's a report deployment. We specify the source for it, our Contoso report subfolder, the one we created as a thin report just earlier. We specify how we authenticate with Power BI service. In this case, we're using a service principal, which is best practice for CI/CD contacts. Finally, we specify one destination environment, which is called development and which references the workspace we deployed into manually earlier. Running a deployment is very straightforward. The command is pbi-tools deploy. We then put a relative folder reference in here, specifying which folder contains the manifest. A dot indicates the current folder, followed by the name of the profile. So line 72 says report. That's what we're referencing here. In order to test things, we can specify -what if, which will basically check that all assumptions made in the manifest are right and things can be resolved and the login works, for instance, without sending anything across to Power BI. So we've just run this with what if. No errors have come up, so that's all fine, which means I can rerun that again without specifying what if, which will then do two things. First of all, it will compile a PBIX file from the Contoso report subfolder, and it will then upload the file into the workspace specified here. And as we've seen, this actually didn't take very much time at all. It just took a few seconds. Going back into the workspace, we can see the report is still there and it still works as it has before. With that in place, we can make a few further edits, and we can then afford to publish and deploy the report very quickly just by running this particular command. There are two further types of edits I wanted to demonstrate in order to highlight the benefits of having a PBIX file in source control and being able to make offline changes. Number one, let's change some visual properties. So if I go into the sales by month page, which is the first page in the report, and if I go to the text box here, remember all visual properties are held inside the config file. So this one is a text box, which means I've got a paragraphs property specifying the various contents showing in that text box. And in fact, this is all pretty straightforward and readable. This particular text actually appears verbatim on the first page. We can see there's some styling here as well. We can see there's a hyperlink embedded. And so why don't we just go in here and actually type something in ourselves without even starting Power BI Desktop. If I say this paragraph was added by a script and save, I can then go down here, rerun my deploy command. That's done. And we can see that the paragraph we just added to our sources is visible down here. There we go. That's precisely what we typed in. And we didn't need to open Power BI Desktop in order to get this added to our particular report. We can also see that the styling or the formatting is different here. So if we switch back and basically learn from the other example where we've got a text style property showing up, we can basically duplicate that and add this down here. And let's say we just want to make this show up as bold. Let's rerun the deploy command, switch back to our Power BI workspace, refresh the report, and we should now see that this in fact is showing up in bold as expected. Let's make a slightly more substantial change, and also one that would definitely not be possible using Power BI Desktop. I'm not sure whether you ever wondered about the particular URLs you access for Power BI reports. This one, for instance, is a very long URL. It's got lots of random characters and numbers in it. And in fact, the last piece is the page identifier. And it turns out that we can actually find this particular name when going through our sources. Let's go and find where that particular term appears in our sources and see whether we can actually customize that. I can use a very handy feature of Visual Studio Code here, which is find in files. So that allows me to paste in a particular term, which VS Code is then going to find throughout any file in my current working directory. And in fact, we can see this particular term is actually found in 9 different files. If I want to make this name more meaningful, I can basically go through the 3 files impacted and just click on this little icon here in order to replace things. I can go and redeploy. Here we go. If I switch back to my workspace and switch across to the first page, look at this. We actually now have the custom phrase we used earlier, and we can see that in our URL, in my view, something a lot more user-friendly. And you can see that this is a very neat capability you've got when interacting with the sources directly. Let's switch back to our slides. Here is another slide for you referencing the deploy command with its syntax and a reference to the online documentation. On the next slide, you can see a screenshot of roughly what a PBI-tools deployment manifest looks like, and a brief explanation of the various components in it. And that concludes our demos. Before I come to an end, there's one more topic I wanted to talk about. Remember in the beginning, I put a disclaimer into the slides, making you aware that we are generally looking at PBIX file internals here, which are not officially documented or officially supported by Microsoft. We could also see how powerful and useful having access to those sources is, and how it actually opens up very interesting scenarios and workflows. Now, this is definitely something the community has raised, and the Microsoft Power BI team have come back with the term desktop hardening, which I wanted to talk about very briefly. Desktop hardening describes internal efforts at Microsoft to document the PBIX file format, officially provide APIs to modify those files, and ultimately allow external tools to make changes to files open in Power BI Desktop. Recently, Matthew Roach, who is on the Power BI CAT team, wrote a blog post about that topic, and the link is in the slides. That concludes my session. Special thanks to our sponsors as well. And of course, thank you very much. Be aware there are different ways of winning prizes. It's all described on this final slide. I hope you got something useful and interesting out of this session. Keep in touch, follow me on Twitter, and find me in the chat. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.